All right, here we are. We're going to talk about factoring quadratics today, specifically the AC method. Factoring quadratics is a really important skill in algebra and advanced mathematics. There are a couple different ways to factor quadratics. This has quickly become my favorite method. Before I actually go into factoring a quadratic, what I'm going to do is multiply these two binomials right here and look at the resulting quadratic. The reasoning for that is factoring is just going backwards with multiplication. If we can really understand multiplication, it gives us a better idea about the factoring process. So let's multiply this out. When I multiply this, I multiply the 3x, and distribute it into both of these, multiply by both of these terms. 3x times 2x is 6x squared. 3x times the negative 4 is negative 12x. 5 times the 2x, and then 5 times the negative 4 would give me a 10x and then a negative 20. As always, when we multiply two binomials, we'll have these middle terms that can be combined together, and so I'll do that step right here, giving us the fully simplified version of this, which is 6x squared minus 2x minus 20. All right, so let's talk about what the AC method is. As all methods of factoring quadratics, the AC method is about going backwards with the multiplication. What the AC method is going to do is it's a process of taking this middle term right here and rewriting it as these two terms it was before it was simplified. That's the way I think about it. We're going to find a way to take this middle term right here and split it into two terms that are equivalent to that middle term of negative 2x, or whatever middle term we have. And then once we get it to here, we implement the concept of factor by grouping. This process right here is what we're going to use the AC method for, is splitting it up. Before we go and do an actual example of doing the AC method, we need to figure out how it works. There's one really important quality that these terms have, the coefficients have, before we simplify them. It always happens this way. It doesn't take long to figure out how or why. I'll give you a little hint in a second. But if we take this A and C coefficient and we multiply them together, we are going to get negative 120. Every single time that we do this, if we multiply these two middle terms together also, we're going to get negative 120. So in this case, again, 6 times negative 20 is 120, and negative 12 times 10 is negative 120. The little hint is that negative 120 is the result of 3 times 5 times 2 times negative 4, and you can kind of figure out why it works like that. So let's look at an example. We'll take that example through the whole AC method process, but don't forget this is the crucial part right here, splitting up that middle term using this logic. Okay, we have a quadratic here, 20w squared plus 3w minus 9. What we're going to do, as advertised, is find a way to split this term up right here into two separate terms that are equivalent to 3w, but have the special property that those two coefficients we're going to use multiply to be the same thing that A and the C multiply to be. In this case, it's negative 180. So what we need to do, and I call this the number game, it's a separate kind of technique that I think is really useful to learn early in algebra. We need to find two numbers, there's only two numbers that work at the same time for this, that multiply to be negative 180 and add to be a 3. I'll write that out here just to make sure that's clear. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 180, and they need to add to a positive 3. I won't go through the process here. That can be explained other ways. For me, my videos, I describe it as the number game. Just quick hints on that. I use prime factorization, factor trees, focusing on the multiplication first. The two numbers that we're looking for that satisfy this criteria are negative 12 and 15. So we're going to use these two numbers to factor that quadratic, or to split up that middle term specifically. So to set this up, I'll just show you that I'm going to write this as a 20w squared. I'm going to leave a space for the two terms I'm going to add here, and then I have a minus 9. Again, I'm going to use negative 12 and 15. I'm going to use those to write a positive 3w. I'll write it as a plus 15w minus 12w. Again, all I'm doing is replacing the 3w with two different terms that actually are equivalent to 3w, and those coefficients multiply to be the same thing that they have there. I bet you can see now that we're going backwards to the same process that we just did previously. Okay, now we need to do factor by grouping. Factor by grouping is by taking two terms at a time and factoring out the greatest common factor. Here, these first two terms, I'm going to factor out a 5w. If I factor out a 5w from 20w squared plus 15w, I'll get a 4w and then a plus 3. Now, in the second set of terms, the negative 12w and the negative 9, I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor. Really important, though, when I'm factor by grouping, don't forget that if this third term is negative, I need to factor out a negative as the greatest common factor. So 3 is the greatest common factor, but I'm going to factor out a negative 3. This isn't special to the AC method. This is always when you're factor by grouping to get this done right. Okay, so I factored out the negative 3. Now what I'm going to do is write what I get when I factor it out. So I'm just dividing both these terms by negative 3 would give me a 4w plus 3. All right, things are working really well for us. In this case right here, these two binomial factors need to be the same for this to work out. That's not what I was trying to do. I was just factoring out the greatest common factor. But if they are the same, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these two terms. I think of these as two terms with a lot of stuff going on here, and I'm going to factor out the 4w plus 3 from both of them. So that will look like this. I'm going to factor out the 4w plus 3. One thing that I do is when I do that, I always kind of just cross these off just to make sure that I'm keeping track of things right. I'm going to factor or divide those out, and what I'm left with is the 5w minus 3, which becomes the other binomial factor. This right here is the final factored form for this quadratic. Again, what I'm doing here is I'm undoing the multiplication process. I'm going to take that middle term that got simplified into one term. I'm going to split it into two special terms. There's only one way to do this if you're going to do it correctly. After that, then I factor by grouping. Always when I'm factor by grouping, I'm going to be very careful about that third term. If that third term has a lead coefficient that's negative, I'm going to factor out a negative. In this case, I factored out a negative 3.